Recently, I started noticing things in my house were slightly out of place. Drawers not fully closed, documents subtly shifted. Suspecting my son, I decided to place a hidden camera in my office. Then the housekeeper, who had worked for me for 14 years, pulled me aside and whispered, "At 2 p.m., watch it. You need to see this yourself." I didn't ask anything else. I pretended I'd be out fishing all day and waited. When the time came, I opened the camera, and what appeared on that screen nearly made me collapse. Welcome to our story. Before we reveal the footage, please like, subscribe, and let us know which city or country you're watching from. Note that this narrative includes dramatized elements for educational value. Any resemblance to actual names or events is coincidental. The core message, however, remains deeply relevant to us all. I walked into my home office on a Tuesday morning in October 2022, and for the first few seconds, the world looked exactly as it should. Outside the window, the old Tennessee oaks were beginning their annual turn, casting long, honey-colored shadows across the floorboards. The air coming through the glass was crisp with the scent of dying leaves and damp earth. Rosa, who had been the ghost in my hallways for 14 years, had already finished her morning rounds and gone. The house was silent, wrapped in that heavy, comfortable stillness that usually feels like a sanctuary. Except it wasn't. I've spent 51 years in the industrial machinery business. When you build things that have to withstand thousands of pounds of pressure, you develop a specific kind of sight. You don't just see a machine. You see the one bolt that's a quarter turn loose, the faint shimmer of hydraulic fluid where it shouldn't be, the microscopic misalignment that eventually leads to a catastrophic break. Most people miss the small things. I've made a fortune by noticing them. My eyes stopped on the heavy oak filing cabinet in the corner. The bottom drawer was sitting open no more than a quarter of an inch, but it was enough. I always shut my drawers tight. The humidity in Millhaven makes the wood swell when it rains, and if you don't seat those drawers firmly in the frame, they stick. I hadn't left that drawer open. I walked over my boots, making a dull thud on the rug Eleanor had bought for this room nearly 4 decades ago. I pulled the drawer open fully. The sound of the metal glides was too smooth, too easy. Someone had been working these files. Inside, the folders were out of order. I keep my life organized by chronology and importance. My property deeds are always at the front, tabbed by the year of acquisition. But now the deed for the Crestwood Lake property, a place Eleanor and I had spent 30 summers, was tucked behind the main house papers. The Fairview Heights commercial unit documents, which should have been in the active asset folder, were stuffed haphazardly at the very bottom. The edges of the paper curled and snagged against the back of the drawer. My heart didn't race. Instead, it went cold and heavy like a lead weight sinking in a well. I turned away from the cabinet and sat down in the armchair by the window. It's a wingback covered in deep burgundy leather that has softened and cracked over 38 years of use. Eleanor picked it out for me when Cole Industrial hit its first million in revenue. "A man who builds the world needs a place to sit and look at it, Ray," she had said. I sat there now, my hands resting on the worn armrests, and looked at my room with the eyes of a stranger. On the third shelf of the mahogany bookcase sits a small wooden box. It's handcrafted walnut, a gift from a client in Nashville. I keep my will and my insurance policies in there. I always, without exception, keep the brass latch facing directly toward the chair, toward me. Now the latch was facing the window. I stood up my joints, complaining slightly in the autumn chill, and reached for the box. When I opened it, the smell of old paper and cedar drifted out. The documents were all there, but the story they told was different. I know how I fold my papers, sharp, crisp edges, 3 perfect sections. These had been unfolded and refolded by someone in a hurry. The creases were soft, doubled in some places, and the staples had been pulled back just enough to suggest someone had photocopied them. My mind went back to Sunday dinner just 3 days ago. We were at Marcus and Diane's house in Ridgeline Estates, one of those new money developments where the houses are too big for the lots, and the trees are still just saplings tied to stakes. Diane had been unusually attentive, hovering over my shoulder as she poured my coffee. She has a smile that never quite reaches her eyes, a sharp, polished kind of beauty that I'd always tried to like for Marcus's sake. "Dad," she had said, her voice like silk. "Have you thought about your estate plan lately? At your age, it might be time to simplify things. Maybe let go of the company, sell the Fairview units, enjoy your retirement while you're still healthy enough to travel." Marcus had nodded, his eyes fixed on his plate. "She's right, Dad. You've worked hard your whole life. You've earned the right to let someone else carry the load." I had changed the subject, making some comment about the Titans game, but the words had felt like vultures circling a kill. I looked at Marcus then, trying to find the boy I used to take to the workshop on Saturday mornings. Instead, I saw a 44-year-old man in an expensive sweater who seemed to be shrinking under the weight of his own life. I remembered Thanksgiving last year. I'd walked into their kitchen to help with the trash and saw a credit card statement sitting on the marble counter. I didn't mean to look, but the balance due was printed in bold, and the number was large enough to buy a mid-sized excavator. Marcus had snatched it away so fast, he almost knocked over a glass of wine. I stood in the center of my office, the walnut box still open in my hands. Only 3 people have keys to this house: me, Marcus, and Diane. Rosa has worked for me since before Eleanor died, 14 years of loyalty and quiet service. But Rosa doesn't have a key. She comes at 8 in the morning when I'm having my first coffee, and I let her in myself. She leaves by noon, long before the shadows of the oaks reach the porch. I set the box down, making sure the latch was facing the window exactly as I had found it. I didn't want them to know I knew. Not yet. I sat back down in Eleanor's chair and looked at the framed photograph on the bookshelf. It's a grainy 4x6 from 1988. Marcus was 10 years old, his face smudged with grease and his eyes bright with a kind of hero worship that made me feel 10 feet tall. We were standing in the middle of the shop floor, his small hand resting on a lathe I was teaching him to calibrate. I looked at that boy's eyes full of light and honesty, and then I looked at the disturbed files in the cabinet. I realized then that I didn't recognize the man who had been in this room today. He was a ghost. I had raised a stranger who had traded his father's trust for a look at a will. The house was still quiet, but the sanctuary was gone. The oaks continued to drop their leaves outside, but for the first time in my life, I felt like the foundation under my feet was starting to crack. I didn't go to the workshop that morning. Usually by 8:15, the smell of machine oil and the steady hum of the lathes are the only things on my mind. But as I sat in Eleanor's chair watching the dust motes dance in a stray beam of Tennessee sunlight, the machinery of my business felt 1,000 miles away. I picked up the phone instead. I didn't wait for Rosa to arrive at her usual time. I dialed her cell directly. She picked up on the second ring, but the hello that came through the line wasn't the cheerful, rhythmic greeting I'd heard for over a decade. It was small, brittle, the sound of someone who had been staring at the phone waiting for it to scream. "Rosanno?" I said, keeping my voice as level as a freshly milled steel plate. "I need to ask you something, and I need the truth. Have you noticed anything unusual at the house lately? Anything at all when I'm not there?" There was a silence so long I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard a ragged intake of breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was trembling, vibrating with a fear that made my grip tighten on the receiver. "Mr. Cole," she whispered. I wanted to tell you. I have tried so many times." The floodgates opened. She told me that Marcus and Diane had been coming to the house 5 or 6 times over the past 3 weeks, always on weekdays, always between 10 in the morning and noon, the window of time when they knew I'd be buried in paperwork or supervising a pour at the foundry. They didn't come to check on the house or leave groceries. They went straight to my office, closing the heavy oak door behind them. The last 2 times, Rosa said, her voice hitching, there was a man with them, a tall man. Gray hair, silver tie. He wore a suit that looked more expensive than my car, Mr. Cole. He carried a heavy leather briefcase like it was full of lead. Then came the sound of Rosa weeping, quiet, muffled sobs that burned my chest. She confessed that Marcus had pulled her aside in the kitchen 2 weeks ago. He hadn't been the boy who used to help her bake cookies anymore. He had stood over her, his shadow long and cold on the linoleum, and told her that if she breathed a word to me, he would report a recent clerical error in her nephew's residency renewal. It was a minor paperwork snag, but Diane had made sure it looked like a deportation order in the making. He held the boy's future like a hostage, and Rosa knew I couldn't protect someone the law hadn't cleared yet. I have been in this country 20 years, Mr. Cole. She sobbed. I have my daughters, my grandbabies. I have worked hard, but I am so afraid. He looked at me like I was nothing. Not like family, just a witness he had to break. I didn't lose my temper. Rage is a luxury for men who don't have a plan, and I was starting to form one. I took a deep breath, the smell of Eleanor's lavender sachet still clinging to the room. Rosa, I said softly. How many years have you prayed for this family? 14 years, Mr. Cole, she choked out. Since Mrs. Eleanor was still here, since the day she held my hand when I was sick. I pray for you every night. Then I need you to do it one more time, I told her. And I need you to tell me everything you heard. She told me about the last visit this past Friday. They were in the office for nearly 2 hours. Rosa had been polishing the silver in the dining room, but the house was so quiet, she could hear the cadence of their voices through the door. Marcus sounded hesitant, his voice low and mumble-heavy. But Diane sounded like a foreman running a job site. Efficient, cold, calculating. She sounded like someone taking an inventory of a life she'd already decided was hers. Rosa described the man's car, a black Lincoln Navigator polished to a mirror finish. It had a specific parking sticker on the windshield, a logo she couldn't quite make out, but it looked professional. A lawyer's mark, or a predator's. I will send you a message, Rosa whispered. I recorded the times. I wrote them down because I felt it in my soul, Mr. Cole. Something is wrong. We hung up. A minute later, my phone vibrated against my palm. I walked out of the house, locked the front door, and climbed into my Ford Expedition. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there in the driveway, the leather seats cold against my back, and read the text message. Watch what happens at 2 p.m. That is when they always come. That is when you will see everything. I looked at the message, then shifted my gaze to the digital clock on the dashboard. It was nearly 8 in the morning. 18 hours. I had 18 hours until tomorrow's shadow crossed that 2 o'clock mark. 18 hours to decide what kind of man I was going to be. I could be the father who let them steal the roof over my head just to keep the peace, or I could be the man who built Cole Industrial from a single toolbox and a dream. I looked at my hands, calloused, scarred, and steady. They had built everything I owned. Now they were going to have to protect it. I reached out and turned the key. The engine roared to life, a low, powerful growl that felt like an answer. By noon, I was driving down Route 9 toward an electronics store on the edge of town. The Tennessee sky had turned a hard, bright blue, the kind that makes the autumn colors look almost violent against the horizon. I didn't go to the big box retailers in the center of Millhaven. I went to a small, dusty shop tucked between a tractor supply store and a diner. I wanted a transaction that left no digital footprint, no paper trail, that a curious son-in-law with an eye on my bank statements could find. The shop smelled of ozone and old cardboard. A young man with a tired face and a lanyard around his neck looked up from a circuit board. I didn't waste time. I told him I needed something small, wireless, and capable of sending a high-definition feed to my phone through a cloud service. He pulled a box from behind the counter, no larger than a pack of matches. "A motion activated," he said, his voice flat. Night vision. It'll ping your phone the second it senses movement. Records straight to a secure server. He showed me how to sync it, how to set the sensitivity so a stray moth wouldn't trigger an alert, and how to access the live feed from anywhere with a signal. I listened with the same focused intensity I used when learning a new CNC interface at the workshop. When he finished, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a roll of bills. I paid in cash, took the small brown paper bag, and walked back out into the crisp afternoon air. I drove home the Ford Expedition, feeling like a mobile command center. I spent 20 minutes in my office, not sitting, but moving with a predator's patience. I tested a dozen angles. The top of the filing cabinet was too obvious. The bookshelf was better, but most of the gaps were too shallow. Finally, I found it. Behind the family photo on the third shelf, the frame was a heavy, dark mahogany wide enough to provide a perfect shadow. I nestled the tiny lens into the microscopic gap between the frame and a thick volume on industrial thermodynamics. From that height, the camera had a clear, unobstructed view of the desk, the filing cabinet, and the door. I walked out to the driveway, pulled up the application on my phone, and waited. The image snapped into focus. It was eerie seeing my sanctuary from a bird's-eye view, the colors muted, but the detail razor-sharp. I could see the grain of the wood on my desk. I could see the latch on the walnut box. I was invisible, yet I saw everything. I walked back inside and stood in front of that photograph for a long time. It was taken at a 4-H fair in the summer of '88. Marcus was 10, his face smeared with the remains of a blue raspberry snow cone, his hand gripping a trophy he'd won for a model bridge project. Eleanor stood beside me, her blue Sunday dress vibrant against the golden hay of the background. I looked younger, thinner, with a grin that spoke of a man who believed the foundation of his life was made of solid granite. We looked like the American dream frozen in a frame. I didn't touch the photograph. I didn't want to leave a smudge or a tilt that Diane's sharp eyes would notice. I just looked at it until the sun began to dip below the oak line, casting the room into a deep, bloody amber. I picked up my phone and called Marcus. My voice was steady. 51 years of bidding on multi-million-dollar contracts teaches you how to keep the tremor out of your throat, even when your heart is hammering against your ribs. "I'm heading out to Crestwood Lake tomorrow, son," I said, leaning against the doorframe of the office. "The base are supposed to be hitting near the old dam. I'm going to make a day of it. Won't be back until well after dark." "Sounds good, Dad," Marcus replied. There was a split-second delay, a sharp intake of breath on his end. "You deserve the break. Enjoy yourself. Don't worry about a thing." His voice sounded lighter, relieved. It was the sound of a man who had just seen a door open. I felt a bitter taste in my mouth like copper. "I will, Marcus. Take care." That evening, Danny stopped by the workshop on his way home. It was his usual Tuesday habit. He'd been with Cole Industrial for a decade, starting as a floor sweeper and working his way up to my right hand. He saw me standing by the main lathe, not working, just staring at the silent machinery. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked, his brow furrowed. Danny was the son I wished I could have built in the workshop, honest, hard-working, and loyal to a fault. "Fine, Danny," I said, patting the cold steel of the lathe. "I'm taking tomorrow off. Going fishing. I need you to keep a close eye on the shop. Make sure that shipment for the Nashville plant gets out on time." "Always, sir. You know I've got it covered," he said. He didn't ask why I looked like I'd aged 5 years since Monday. He just nodded his eyes, showing a quiet understanding that didn't require words. That was the thing about Danny. He knew the value of silence. I drove home and sat in my office until long after the stars had filled the Tennessee sky. I didn't turn on the overhead light, just the small desk lamp. The house was so quiet. I could hear the oak leaves scratching against the siding in the wind. The camera was there, tucked behind my past, waiting to record my future. Before I reached over to turn off the lamp, I looked at that fair photo one last time. I looked at 10-year-old Marcus, his eyes wide with pride, looking up at me like I was the center of his universe. I tried to remember the last time my son had looked at me with that kind of honesty without the veil of debt and Diane's whispers. I searched my memory going back through the holidays, the birthdays, the Sunday dinners. I couldn't find it. The boy in the photo felt like a ghost, and the man I'd spoken to on the phone felt like a stranger I was about to trap. I clicked off the lamp, leaving the office to the night and the unblinking eye of the camera. Wednesday morning. I left the house at 7, drove to the end of Millhaven Creek Road, and parked behind a thick row of old sycamores where the property line bends. The trees provided a natural screen, their broad skeleton-like branches partially obscured by a thin morning fog that clung to the damp Tennessee fields. I was only 200 yards from my own front door, yet I felt like I was in a different country. I sat in the Ford Expedition, with the engine off the interior slowly cooling until the air felt as sharp as a razor. My fishing gear sat untouched in the back rod's tackle box, and a cooler of ice acting as a silent alibi for anyone who happened to pass by. My phone was propped on the dashboard, the camera application open. The image of my office was steady, bathed in the gray flat light of a morning that didn't know it was about to witness a betrayal. Hours passed. The fog burned off, replaced by a cold, indifferent sun. I watched the clock on the dash crawl through the morning. 10, 11, 12. My coffee grew cold in the cup holder, but I didn't drink. I just stared at the screen, a digital hunter waiting for the prey to enter the clearing. Nothing happened until 1:47 p.m. The white Cadillac Escalade turned into my driveway with a quiet, expensive crunch of gravel. Marcus was at the wheel. Diane sat in the passenger seat, her profile sharp and focused. A second later, a black Lincoln Navigator pulled in directly behind them, and from its back seat stepped the tall man in the dark suit, the one Rosa had described. He moved with a practiced predatory grace, a leather briefcase swinging at his side. I watched on the screen as Marcus used his key. They walked through the front door of the house I had built with my own sweat, and moments later they appeared in the office. Diane didn't hesitate. She went straight to the filing cabinet, her movements practiced and efficient. She didn't look at the books or the mementos Eleanor had collected over a lifetime. She didn't look at the room as a place of memories. She saw it as a vault. She pulled out the property deeds and spread them across my desk, smoothing the papers with a flat, cold palm. The man in the suit opened his briefcase, his back to the bookshelf. "Everything is here," Diane said, her voice coming through the phone's speaker with chilling clarity. "The house, the lake property, the Fairview Heights commercial unit the company shares, all of it." The lawyer tapped a stack of documents with a silver pen. "I have the transfer documents prepared. The language is ironclad. We just need his signature. He will sign," Marcus said. His voice was lower than the others, lacking Diane's sharp edge. "Once we move him into the facility, he will sign anything we put in front of him just to get some peace." Facility, the word hit me harder than a physical blow. Not a care home, not a retirement community where he could see the trees and have his coffee. A facility. To them, I wasn't a father or a man who had built a legacy from a single toolbox. I was a piece of aging industrial equipment that had become a liability, something to be decommissioned and relocated to a warehouse until the warranty ran out. Diane continued, her finger tracing a line on one of the deeds. "Dr. Strang has already agreed. He'll certify early-stage cognitive decline. It's a standard diagnosis for someone his age. Once we have that assessment filed, the guardianship petition is straightforward. The court won't even question it." Marcus picked up the deed to the Crestwood Lake property. For a long moment he was quiet, staring at the paper. Maybe he was thinking about the summers we spent there, or the way Eleanor used to sit on the dock at sunset. Diane looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "Marcus," she prompted. He didn't look at her. He just gave a short, jerky nod and set the paper back down. "Let's just get it done." They began gathering the documents, the lawyer sliding them back into his briefcase. Before they turned to leave, Marcus walked toward the bookshelf. He stopped right in front of the family photograph, the one from the 4-H fair. I held my breath. my grip tightening on the steering wheel of the expedition. Through the lens of the hidden camera, I was looking directly into my son's eyes. He stood there for 3 full seconds, staring at the frozen image of his younger self and the mother who had loved him more than her own life. His expression was unreadable, not guilt, not sorrow, just a hollow, distant stare. Then he turned away, followed Diane out of the office, and closed the door. I watched the white Escalade back out of the driveway and disappear down the road, the Lincoln Navigator trailing it like a shadow. I sat there for a long time, the engine still off, the silence in the truck echoing the silence in my house. My fishing gear remained in the back, the ice in the cooler slowly melting into a pool of cold water. I had told Marcus I was going to Crestwood Lake. I never had any intention of going. The only thing I had caught today was a glimpse of the monsters I had invited to Sunday dinner. I drove home after they left. The gravel under my tires sounded like breaking glass in the predatory silence of the afternoon. When I stepped inside, I didn't reach for the light switch. I let the front door click shut behind me and stood in the foyer, allowing the gray twilight to swallow me whole. I didn't go into the office. I couldn't. Not tonight. The leather chair. Eleanor chose the mahogany bookshelf, the invisible eye of the camera still recording the empty room. It all felt like a stage set for a play I no longer wanted to act in. Instead, I walked into the living room and sat on the floral-patterned sofa where Eleanor used to read on Sunday afternoons. I didn't take off my coat. I just sat there in the deepening dark, my hands resting heavy on my knees, and I didn't move for a long, long time. In the machinery business, when a structural beam fails, you can usually trace the fracture back to a single point of impact. But as I sat there, the questions hit me like a slow-moving landslide. It wasn't about Diane. I understood Diane now. She was a force of nature, cold and transactional, a storm that had found a weak spot in my family's roof. My questions were all for Marcus. I thought about the hot July morning in 1978 when he was born. I remembered the sterile smell of the hospital and the way his tiny wrinkled hand had clamped around my index finger, gripping it with a strength that seemed impossible for something so small. He wouldn't let go. I thought about the dusty autumn afternoon when he was 15, sitting in the passenger seat of my old beat-up pickup on the back road behind the property. I had let him take the wheel, watching his face tighten with a mix of terror and pride as he navigated the ruts in the dirt. But the memory that hurt the most was the morning Eleanor died. We were in a white, cold hallway in the Nashville hospital. I was broken, a man who had lost his North Star, and Marcus had sat beside me for 3 hours without saying a single word. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just placed his hand on my forearm and left it there, a steady weight that told me I wasn't alone. That was the last time I felt like his father, in the way that truly counted, the last time our bond was made of something stronger than blood. Around 1 a.m, the house was so quiet, I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall each second, sounding like a hammer on an anvil. I picked up my phone. The screen was a blinding artificial white in the dark room. I scrolled to Marcus's number. My thumb hovered over the call button, trembling. I thought, just let it go, Ray. Give it to them. Let them take the company, the house, the lake property. What does any of it matter if the boy you raised is gone anyway? Maybe the facility is where I belong now. Maybe I'm just an old man clutching at shadows. I reached out to set my keys on the side table, intending to lie down and let the world win. But as I did, my fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. It was Eleanor's bracelet. It's a thin silver band, simple and elegant, bought at a small silversmith shop in Nashville the year we were married. She had worn it every day for 31 years, through the lean times when we shared a single sandwich for lunch, and the good times when Coal Industrial took over the old mill. After she passed, I placed it on that side table. I never moved it. It was the last thing she took off before she went to the hospital for the last time. The silver caught a sliver of moonlight. I picked it up, the metal warming instantly in my palm. I thought of Eleanor's voice, not the soft version from my dreams, but the real one. The one that told me to stand straight when the bank tried to call in our first loan. The one that told me a man's legacy isn't what he leaves behind, but what he refuses to let go of. I put my phone face down on the sofa cushion beside me. I wasn't going to call Marcus. Not to surrender. Instead, I dialed Pastor Roy. It was past 1 a.m. an hour for emergencies and late-night vigils. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep but instantly alert. "Ray," he asked. "Is everything all right?" "Onikeo," I said, my voice sounding like gravel underfoot. "I just need to hear the voice of someone I trust. Someone who remembers who I am." "I'm right here, Ray," he said. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't pry. For nearly 10 minutes, we stayed on the line in near-perfect silence. I could hear his steady breathing, and he could hear mine. It was a bridge of human decency thrown across a dark canyon. That was enough. Before I hung up, Roy said one thing. "Whatever it is you're facing, Ray, you already know what to do. You've always been a man who knows the difference between a foundation and a facade. You always have." I didn't answer. I couldn't. But I knew he was right. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even try. At 4:30, the first hint of gray light began to bleed into the eastern sky. I stood up, my joints stiff, and walked into the kitchen. I made a pot of coffee, the smell of the roasted beans filling the room like a familiar ghost. I sat at the kitchen table and watched the dawn creep across the fields, lighting up the oak trees that Eleanor had loved so much. The time for questions was over. The time for the father had passed, and the time for the man who built Coal Industrial had begun. I felt a strange, cold clarity settling into my bones, a steady calibration of intent. At exactly 7 o'clock, I picked up my phone again. My thumb didn't tremble this time. I dialed the number for Arthur Brennan. Arthur Brennan has had an office on Main Street in Millhaven for 31 years. It's a red brick building with a solid oak door and a brass nameplate that's been polished so often the edges of the letters have softened. I've been his client for 27 of those years. He handled the incorporation of Coal Industrial, the purchase of the Fairview Heights commercial units, and the quiet, painful drafting of Eleanor's final arrangements. I arrived at 8:45 and sat in my Ford Expedition for 5 minutes, watching the morning foot traffic on Main Street. People were going about their lives, buying coffee, opening shop doors, complaining about the early frost. They lived in a world where children didn't plan to decommission their fathers. I stepped out of the truck, clutching a manila envelope and my phone, and walked inside. Arthur didn't make me wait. He dismissed a younger associate with a brief wave and pointed me toward the heavy wingback chair across from his desk. I didn't offer any small talk. I simply set my phone on his blotter and pressed play. He watched the footage twice. The first time he leaned forward, his eyes narrowed behind silver-framed spectacles. The second time he sat back, his hands steepled under his chin. Arthur is the kind of man who learned long ago not to let his face react before his mind has finished its work. He's seen every shade of human greed Millhaven has to offer. But as the video reached the 3-second mark, where Marcus stared at the family photo, I saw Arthur's jaw tighten. The muscle there bunched under his skin like a coiled spring. He slid the phone back to me and spoke, his voice a low, rhythmic baritone that carried the weight of a judge's gavel. "Pty Ray," he said, "what they are doing is elder financial exploitation under Tennessee law. It is a specific, ugly category of theft. If Dr. Strang submits a falsified medical assessment to a court, that is perjury. If they attempt to execute those transfer documents under a fraudulent guardianship, that is criminal fraud. This isn't a civil dispute over an inheritance, Ray. This is a criminal conspiracy." We spent the next 2 hours in a focused, clinical silence, broken only by the scratching of his fountain pen and the occasional rustle of paper. By the time the noon sun was hitting the brickwork of Main Street, Arthur had prepared the documents to transfer every asset I owned into a revocable living trust. The house in Millhaven, the Crestwood Lake property, the Fairview Heights units, every single share of Cole Industrial. He leaned across the desk, looking me directly in the eye. Here is how it works, Ray. The trust is now the legal owner of these assets. You are the trustee. Even if a court were to be misled into granting Marcus and Diane guardianship over you personally, they cannot touch what is held in the trust. It's an ironclad shield. They can control where you sleep, perhaps, but they cannot spend a single cent of Eleanor's legacy. Arthur paused, tapping his pen against the blotter. Now we have two paths. We can take this evidence to the district attorney's office right now. We can end this before the sun goes down. I felt the weight of Eleanor's silver bracelet in my pocket, the one I'd carried with me since 4 a.m. And the other path, we wait. Arthur said, his eyes hardening. We let them file their petition. We let them stand before a judge and swear to those lies under oath. Then we walk into that courtroom, and we close the trap. We catch them in the act, in a place where they cannot claim they were just discussing options or acting in your best interest, and it leaves them no exit. I looked out the window at the quiet street. I thought about Marcus's lightened voice on the phone. I thought about the word facility. I choose to wait, I said. I want there to be no exit for them, Arthur. None. Arthur nodded slowly. Then, until then, you must act normal. You answer their calls. You attend their dinners if they ask. You let them believe their plan is moving with the precision of a Swiss watch. Can you do that, Ray? I've been managing difficult people for 50 years, I replied. I can do it for a few more days. Before I stood up to leave, Arthur added something I hadn't expected. I'm also going to contact D.A. Cooper's office tonight. Not to file formal charges, not yet. I'm going to brief him on the situation, provide him with a copy of the evidence, and have his office standing by. If we are going to do this in open court, I want law enforcement prepared to move the moment the judge rules. I won't have them slipping away into the night. I stood by the door, my hand on the cold brass handle. Arthur, if this were your son, what would you do? The silence that followed was heavy. Arthur looked at a photograph on his own desk. His daughter's wedding, perhaps, or a grandson's graduation. He took a long, slow breath. Exactly what we are doing right now, Ray, he said softly. Exactly this. Because the greatest mercy you can show a man who has lost his way is to stop him before he goes any further. I drove home with the trust documents in a folder on the passenger seat. The late afternoon sun was hitting the oaks, turning the world a bruised, deep orange. Cole Industrial was protected. The house was protected. Even the leather chair Eleanor had picked out was now legally shielded by a wall of ink and paper. I should have felt a massive wave of relief, a loosening of the knot in my chest. I didn't. Not yet. The victory felt hollow, a strategic win in a war I never wanted to fight. But as I pulled into my driveway and saw the house standing there, stately, silent, and safe, I felt something else. For the first time since Tuesday morning, the ground under my feet felt solid again. I wasn't just a victim waiting for the blow to fall. I was a man who had chosen his ground. I wasn't standing still anymore. I was moving. The following Monday, Arthur called me at the workshop before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. The morning air in the plant was thick with the scent of coolant and ozone, the steady rhythmic thrum of the heavy presses vibrating through the concrete floor. It was a sound that usually centered me, but the urgency in Arthur's voice knocked the world off its axis again. Requisition, he said, skipping the pleasantries. I had my IT consultant run a deep dive on the Cole Industrial server access logs. We found a ghost in the machine. According to the logs, someone using internal administrative credentials had accessed the restricted financial record server at 11 p.m. on 3 separate nights over the past 3 weeks. They weren't just looking at invoices. They were downloading deep-tier data asset valuations, year-over-year revenue projections, and the full contract portfolio for our Nashville and Memphis clients. The login belonged to Pete Galloway. I looked through my office window. Pete was out on the floor leaning over a technician's shoulder near the new CNC line. He was a big man, a former Marine with graying hair and hands that could strip a diesel engine in the dark. I'd promoted him to operations manager 16 years ago because I trusted his instincts, but I realized now I was looking at the wrong gauges. Pete had been clever. He buried his tracks in the small consumption accounts and obsolete machinery maintenance, the dark corners of the ledger where a busy owner usually trusts a manager's signature without a second glance. I saw the totals, but I never saw the rot underneath. "I'll handle it, Arthur," I said, my voice as cold as the steel outside. I called Pete into my office and closed the heavy glass door, shutting out the roar of the machines. I didn't ask him to sit. I simply turned my computer monitor around so he could see the glowing red lines of the access log. Pete didn't try to play the fool. He looked at the screen, and for a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the air conditioner. Then the color drained from his face, leaving him looking gray and hollowed out. He tried to hold the line for about 30 seconds. His shoulders squared, the old military discipline trying to shield him. Then his posture broke, and he let out a long, shuddering breath. I didn't take any money, Ray," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I swear to God, not a dime." He told me that Diane had approached him 4 months ago at a local diner. She didn't come with a bribe. She came with a folder. Inside were records of falsified expense reports Pete had submitted 6 years ago, nearly 80 small entries totaling about $4,000. At the time, Pete had been drowning in a gambling problem he'd hidden from everyone. He'd since found his way out of that hole, but Diane had found the trail he thought he'd burned. She told him it was simple. Provide her with the internal financial data she needed to evaluate the family legacy, and the folder stayed in her private safe. Refuse or tell me, and the records went to the district attorney and the board of directors. I tried to find a way to tell you, Ray." Pete said, his eyes glassy with shame. "I really did. But every time I saw you, she was there. At the company picnic, at your Sunday dinners, she'd just catch my eye and smile. I felt like a man walking around with a detonator in my pocket, and she was the only one with the remote. I felt a coldness settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the morning chill. I looked at Pete, really looked at him, and I didn't see a traitor. I saw a man who had been caught in a trap set by a professional. How long has she had that evidence on you, Pete?" I asked. "How long has she been holding those reports?" Pete looked down at his boots. "When she first contacted me 4 months ago, I asked her that. I asked how she even found them. She told me she'd been collecting contingencies on everyone close to the Cole family since before she ever married Marcus. She said she liked to be prepared for every outcome." As I looked at the access logs again, I noticed Pete hadn't just opened current files. He'd been forced to dig into settled contracts from over a decade ago, files on old partners like Gerald Foss that should have been buried in dust. Diane wasn't just looking for a way into my office. She was looking for a way to burn the whole building down if the front door stayed locked. I stood up and walked to the window. Below me, the machines were running the same lathes and presses I'd bought with a high-interest loan back when Cole Industrial was just 11 men in a rented garage. I watched them move, precise and indifferent, doing the work they were designed for. "She collected that evidence before she ever sat down for her first Sunday dinner," I said. I wasn't speaking to Pete. I was speaking to the ghost of the family I thought I had. Diane hadn't just married into this family. She had invaded it. She had spent years quietly mapping the structural weaknesses of my life, identifying the people I trusted most, and turning them into silent switches she could flip when the time was right. Pete stood by the door, his large hands trembling slightly. "What happens now, Ray? Are you calling the police?" I turned back to him. The anger was there, but it was buried under a layer of cold, hard pragmatism. I need to think, Pete. For now, you go back out there. You do not access another file. You do not contact Diane. You do not change your routine by one single degree. If she calls you for more data, you tell her the server is undergoing a security audit, and it'll be a few days. Do you understand? He nodded, a sharp, desperate movement. Yes, sir. Go on then, I said. Get back to work. After Pete left, I sat alone in my office for a long time, the silence pressing in on me. The picture I had been holding in my mind since Tuesday morning. The image of Marcus as the architect of this betrayal shifted and warped until it disappeared. My son wasn't the mastermind. He wasn't the one who had spent 6 years gathering leverage and mapping out my assets like a general preparing for a siege. Marcus was just another piece on the board. He had been handed a role in a play that Diane had been writing since the day she met him. I thought of Marcus standing in front of the family photo for 3 seconds. I'd thought it was guilt. Now I wondered if it was something else. I wondered if he was looking at that 10-year-old boy and trying to remember when he'd lost control of his own life. Diane hadn't just come for my money. She had dismantled my son and used the pieces to build a cage for me. But as I watched the machines on the floor continue their steady work, I realized she had made one mistake. She assumed that by controlling the people around me, she controlled me. She forgot that I'm the one who built the machines, and I know exactly how to shut them down. In the 8 days that followed, they came back twice. I watched them both times. The machinery of the shop continued to grind and hum around me, but my true office had moved into the palm of my hand. I would sit in my Ford Expedition in the plant's gravel parking lot, where the air was thick with the scent of hot asphalt and the distant metallic shriek of a high-speed grinder from Section 4. Usually the steady vibration of the shop floor felt like a heartbeat, but today it felt like a countdown. I didn't look at the sky. I looked at the gray, unyielding concrete of the plant, realizing that even the strongest structures can be dismantled from the inside out. This time I wasn't looking at what they were doing. I'd already seen the deeds and the folders. This time I was watching how they did it. I was looking for the structural integrity of their partnership. The first return visit happened on a Tuesday. Just Marcus and Diane. No lawyer this time. They entered the office with the ease of people who already owned the air they were breathing. Diane went straight to my mahogany desk, pulling out a yellow legal pad and a pen. She began cross-referencing papers from the filing cabinet with a list she already had. Marcus, however, didn't sit. He drifted. He stood behind her for a moment, his hands in his pockets, looking over her shoulder, like a junior apprentice watching a master craftsman. He didn't suggest anything. He didn't point to a specific folder. He just waited for her to point, and then he would nod. At one point, while Diane was busy highlighting a section of the Fairview Heights lease agreement, Marcus walked away. He went to the window and stood there for nearly a full minute, staring out at the backyard, at the old tire swing I'd hung for him 30 years ago, which was now just a weathered circle of rubber against a graying oak. His shoulders were slumped, his reflection in the glass, looking ghostly and thin. Diane didn't look up. She didn't ask what he was thinking. She didn't even seem to notice he'd left her side. She just kept writing her pen, moving with a rhythmic, predatory efficiency. The second visit came 3 days later, and this time the lawyer was back. The audio on the camera was sharp enough to catch the clink of the lawyer's silver cufflinks against the desk. They were finalizing the timeline. Dr. Strang will file the medical assessment on Thursday. The lawyer said, his voice as dry as parchment. We'll have the emergency guardianship petition in front of the judge by Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, Marcus, you'll have signature authority over all accounts. We move for the freeze on the industrial assets immediately after. Diane leaned back in my chair, Eleanor's chair, and crossed her legs. And the facility? Is the room ready? Reserved and paid for, the lawyer replied. She nodded, her face set in a mask of cold satisfaction. It was the same look I'd seen on Pete's face when a shipment of precision parts arrived on time. To her, I was just a logistical hurdle that had finally been cleared. "What about the housekeeper?" Diane asked suddenly, her eyes snapping toward Marcus. "Rosa, she's seen us here, she's not stupid," Marcus answered, and this was the part I played back twice that night in the quiet of the workshop. "She won't say a word," he said. "I've handled it." His voice didn't sound like the voice of a man giving an order. It didn't have the weight of authority or the steel of conviction. It sounded like a boy in a school play reciting lines he'd practiced until his throat was sore. It was a hollow imitation of toughness. He was saying what he thought a strong man was supposed to say, to keep a woman like Diane satisfied. I called Arthur that evening from the shop floor. The night shift was just starting, the sparks from the grinders flying like miniature stars in the shadows. "Pretty," I told him. "They're moving on Friday." "Sure, good." Arthur said, his voice steady over the line. "Dia Cooper has been fully briefed. He's assigned 2 investigators to be in the gallery. We have the trust documents, the video logs, and Pete's sworn affidavit regarding the coercion. We'll be ready, Ray. Just keep playing the part for 4 more days." 4 days, I whispered. I hung up and looked at the calendar on the workshop wall. It was the one Rosa gave me every Christmas, a simple, spiral-bound thing with photos of the Smoky Mountains and the rolling hills of Middle Tennessee. I looked at the date and marked it with a heavy black X. 4 days until the trap snapped shut. But as I sat there, something strange happened. The bone-deep fury I'd been carrying for Marcus began to shift. Watching that footage again, seeing him stand by that window, ignored and diminished by the woman he'd allowed to steer his life. I didn't just feel anger. I felt a cold, sharp pity that was almost worse. I saw a man who had traded his soul for the illusion of being taken care of. He wasn't the wolf. He was the dog the wolf kept on a short leash to make the hunt look legitimate. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I wasn't just angry at my son. I was angry for him. I was angry that the boy who used to look at me with such honest pride had let himself be dismantled until there was nothing left but a script and a suit. 4 days. I would save my legacy and I would save my home. But looking at that calendar, I realized that the son I was trying to remember was already gone, buried under layers of Diane's whispers and his own cowardice. The countdown had begun, and in 4 days, only one of us would be standing when the dust settled. Thursday came the way bad days usually do, quietly with no warning in the weather. The Tennessee sky was a pale, washed-out gray, and the air held a damp chill that smelled of wood smoke and wet pavement. I was in the workshop checking the tolerances on a set of drive shafts when the phone in my pocket vibrated. It was Diane. Her voice was warm, honeyed with a concern that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Dad, Marcus and I have been talking. We just want to spend some quiet time with you today. No business, no talk about the future. Just the 3 of us at the Mill Haven Grill. 1 o'clock. I'll be there." I said, my voice as steady as the machines around me. I arrived at 12:50. I was wearing my Sunday leather jacket, the one Eleanor had bought me for our 30th anniversary. My phone was tucked into my shirt pocket. The microphone pointed upward, already recording. In Tennessee, one-party consent laws mean this recording was a legal weapon, a fact Arthur had confirmed during a late-night call the evening before. "Let her talk, Ray," he'd said. "Let her say it all." The Mill Haven Grill was a local institution. Dark wood booths, the smell of fried catfish and strong coffee, and a steady roar of lunchtime conversation that provided the perfect white noise for a betrayal. Marcus and Diane were already seated at a table by the far window. Diane looked the part of the perfect grieving-in-advance daughter-in-law. She wore a soft navy cardigan, her hair chiseled into a neat bob, her hands folded primly on the white tablecloth. Marcus was staring at the menu, his shoulders hunched as if he were trying to disappear into the vinyl seat. I sat down, and before I could even unfold my napkin, Diane reached across the table and took my hand. Her skin was smooth and cold. She said, her eyes wide with a practiced liquid sympathy. We've been so worried about you. Marcus mentioned you've been forgetful lately. The missed calls, the wandering eyes. We just want you to know you don't have to carry this anymore. I said nothing. I let her hand rest on mine like a dead weight. She began to describe a retirement community on the outskirts of Millhaven. She spoke of the manicured gardens, the koi pond, and the 24-hour support staff. She made it sound like a vacation. You wouldn't have to worry about coal industrial anymore, she whispered. The stress is what's doing this to you, Ray. Marcus finally looked up, though not at me. He looked at a spot somewhere near my collar. She's right, Dad. We've already found buyers for the Fairview units. People who would give you a fair price for the workshop, too. You built something real. You deserve to rest while you still can. I looked at my son. I looked at the way he couldn't meet my gaze, the way his fingers were nervously shredding a sugar packet. Then I looked back at Diane. I slowly withdrew my hand from hers and set my coffee cup down with a deliberate metallic clink. Are you trying to help me? I asked, my voice low enough to be private but sharp enough to cut. Or are you just helping yourselves? The warmth in Diane's face didn't fade. It vanished. It was as if a light had been switched off in a basement. Her features sharpened, her eyes turning into two chips of flinty gray ice. She didn't even look at Marcus for permission. Fine, she said. Her voice was a flat, clinical rasp that had no room for family. You want to do this the hard way? Then we'll do it the hard way. By tomorrow morning, a judge will declare you legally incapacitated. Dr. Strang has already filed the clinical assessment. The petition is in the system. There isn't a lawyer in Millhaven who can stop a medical certification of cognitive decline at your age. I looked at Marcus. Is this what you want, son, to put your father in a cage and sell his life's work before the ink on the deeds is even dry? Marcus didn't answer. He didn't defend her, and he didn't stop her. He just stared down at the table, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He was a hollow man, a vessel for her ambition, and in that moment, the silence he offered was the most painful thing I had ever felt. Diane stood up, smoothing her navy cardigan with a sharp, brisk motion. She didn't look like a daughter-in-law anymore. She looked like a creditor coming to collect a debt. I enjoy your last evening of freedom, old man, she said, her voice dripping with a casual, terrifying cruelty. We'll see you in court at 9 a.m. Marcus, let's go. She turned and walked out, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with a rhythmic military precision. Marcus stood up to follow. He stopped at the door for a split second, his back still turned to me, his head bowed. For a heartbeat, I thought he might turn around. I thought the boy from the workshop might finally speak, but he didn't. He stepped out into the gray Tennessee afternoon, leaving the door to swing shut behind him. I sat alone at the table with 2 untouched cups of coffee and a cold plate of bread. The lunchtime crowd at the grill moved around me like water flowing around a jagged stone, people laughing, clinking silverware, talking about the weather. They didn't know that a 30-year legacy had just been declared dead at a window table. I reached into my pocket and turned off the recording. The silence Marcus had left behind was louder than anything Diane had yelled. It was the silence of a house with no foundation. The silence of a son who had chosen a script over a soul. I picked up my leather jacket and walked out. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a soldier who had just seen the enemy's full strength. And tomorrow, they were going to find out that I hadn't been standing still. I drove home from the Millhaven Grill at 2:15, the tires of the Ford Expedition kicking up the damp gravel of the back roads. My chest felt tight, not with fear, but with the kind of pressurized stillness that precedes a boiler explosion. I called Arthur before I even pulled into my driveway. It's done, Arthur. I said, my voice sounding like it was being pulled through a rock crusher. She said it all. The doctor, the petition, the facility. I have the whole thing on tape. Everything is in place, Ray. Arthur replied, his tone professional, yet carrying a sliver of protective steel. The DA's office is standing by. I've filed the trust documents with the clerk's office as a preemptive strike. Go home. Get some rest. I almost laughed at that. Rest is for men who aren't about to watch their only son try to lock them in a cage. I'll see you at 9, Arthur. When I walked through the front door, the scent of lemon oil and slow-cooked pot roast met me. Rosa was still there, standing in the kitchen much later than her usual noon departure. She didn't ask about the lunch. She didn't ask why I looked like I'd just aged a decade in 2 hours. She simply walked over, placed her small, calloused hand over mine on the marble counter, and looked me in the eye. "Mrs. Eleanor would be proud of you, Mr. Cole," she whispered. "She always said you were the strongest man in Tennessee because you knew when to be quiet and when to stand up." I just nodded. I couldn't trust my voice to say a single word. Danny arrived at 7 o'clock. He didn't knock. He just walked in with that steady, dependable gait I'd seen on the shop floor for 10 years. I sat him down in the living room and told him everything: the filing cabinet, the hidden camera, the betrayal at the grill, and the plan for tomorrow morning. Danny listened with the focused intensity of a man studying a complex blueprint. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he stood up, his jaw set in a hard line that reminded me more of myself than Marcus ever had. "What do you need me to do, sir?" he asked. "Just stay here tonight, Danny," I said. "I don't want to be alone in this house tonight. Not with the ghosts." He didn't hesitate. He took off his work jacket, tossed it over the arm of the sofa, and sat back down. "I'm not going anywhere, Ray. You know that." I didn't sleep. But I didn't sit in the dark either. That was for Tuesday night, the night of doubt. Tonight was for action. Around midnight, I walked to the cedar closet at the far end of the hallway, a place that still smelled faintly of Eleanor's perfume. I reached into the very back and pulled out the charcoal gray suit. Eleanor had chosen it for me 22 years ago for Marcus's wedding. I remembered the day we bought it in Nashville. She'd spent an hour picking out the exact shade of silk for the tie to match her dress. I'd worn it only 3 times since the wedding, at her funeral and at 2 industry awards ceremonies. I laid the suit out on the bed. I spent the next 2 hours ironing the shirt, pressing the creases into the trousers with a precision that would have made a drill sergeant proud. There is a specific kind of meditation in manual labor. The steam from the iron, the rhythmic motion of my arm, it calibrated my mind. By 3 a.m., I was at the kitchen table, a tin of black polish and a horsehair brush in front of me. I worked the polish into my leather shoes until they shone like polished obsidian. Danny was asleep on the sofa, his steady breathing the only sound in the house. I made a fresh pot of coffee at 4 a.m. and stood by the back door watching the 12 acres of Tennessee land Eleanor and I had fought so hard to keep. In the darkness, the oaks looked like sentinels guarding a legacy that was currently under siege. At 5:30 a.m., I began to dress. I shaved with a straight razor, my hand as steady as it had been 40 years ago. I put on the crisp white shirt, the silk tie, and finally the charcoal jacket. I stopped at the hallway mirror on my way out, the one Eleanor had hung there shortly after we moved in. She'd told me she wanted the last thing I saw every morning to be the man she loved. I looked at the reflection staring back at me. 73 years old. A map of scars and stories written on my face. But my back was straight, my eyes were clear, and I was still standing. Danny woke up as I was picking up my keys. He stood up, rubbing his eyes, and looked at me in the suit. He didn't say I looked good. He just nodded, a look of profound respect crossing his face. "I'll follow you down there in my truck, sir. I'll be in the back of the courtroom." "Thank you, Danny," I said. I drove toward the Millhaven County Courthouse as the sun began to break over the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and cold golds. The charcoal suit felt heavy, a suit chosen for a celebration of a son's new life. I didn't think Eleanor would mind that I was wearing it for a slightly different occasion. Today wasn't a wedding, but it was a ceremony of sorts. It was the day the truth was finally going to be told in a room where silence wasn't allowed. I pulled into the parking lot across from the courthouse. The brick building looked imposing in the early light, the scales of justice carved above the door. I took a deep breath, adjusted the silver bracelet in my pocket, and stepped out into the cold morning air. I'm sitting in the courthouse parking lot, my wife's charcoal suit feeling like armor. After weeks of silence, the truth is finally ready to speak. If you've walked with me this far, please comment the number 11 to let me know you're still by my side before I face them. A brief heads up. Certain parts of this journey involve dramatized elements and creative storytelling. If this path doesn't suit your interests, feel free to step away now. But for those staying, the gavel is about to fall. Arthur Brennan and 2 officers from the district attorney's office were waiting on the granite steps of the Mill Haven County Courthouse at 8:30 Friday morning. The air was biting a sharp Tennessee frost, clinging to the iron railings. Arthur looked at me, his eyes scanning my charcoal suit, and gave a single solemn nod of approval. The officers were from D.A. Cooper's specialized financial crimes unit. Arthur had spent most of Thursday evening hand-delivering our evidence package, the motion-activated video, the Mill Haven grill recording, and Pete's signed affidavit. Cooper had seen enough. He'd authorized the officers to attend the hearing with the power to detain if the judge found probable cause. The trust documents are already in the judge's digital file, Arthur said, handing me a physical copy. They think they're walking into an empty room to claim a prize. Let them make their move first, Ray. Let them dig the hole. We entered the courthouse, the marble floors echoing with the weight of our footsteps. I stood in the hallway, looking through the narrow vertical pane of glass in the heavy mahogany door of courtroom 4B. Inside, I could see Marcus and Diane. They were seated at the petitioner's table. Diane looked like the picture of professional concern in a sharp, dark blazer, her posture as straight as a ruler. Marcus sat beside her, his hands laid flat on the table, staring at a spot on the wall. He looked small somehow, as if the room were slowly shrinking around him. Dr. Philip Strang sat in the front row of the gallery, dressed in a crisp white lab coat, the very image of medical authority. The hearing began. I stayed in the hallway listening as Diane's attorney stood and addressed Judge Holloway. Your Honor. The attorney began, his voice smooth and rehearsed. We are here this morning to petition for emergency guardianship over Raymond Cole. Mr. Cole is 73 years old, and as the evidence will show, is suffering from significant cognitive decline. We have a clinical assessment from Dr. Philip Strang, confirming early-stage impairment that renders him unable to manage his own affairs or his company, Cole Industrial. Given the urgency of his financial liabilities, we request that his son, Marcus Cole, be appointed legal guardian with full authority over all assets immediately. Judge Holloway, a woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen every lie in Mill Haven, looked over her spectacles. Is Mr. Cole present in the building? No, Your Honor, Diane's attorney replied without blinking. He was not notified of this morning's hearing due to deep clinical concerns regarding his current mental state and the potential for a volatile reaction. That was the cue. Arthur didn't hesitate. He reached out and pushed the heavy mahogany doors open. The sound of the hinges was a low groan in the silent room. I walked in behind Arthur, my heels striking the floor with a steady industrial rhythm. I wasn't the confused old man they had described. I was the man who had built Mill Haven's largest employer, and I was wearing the suit my wife had chosen for my son's wedding. Marcus turned around. The room seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of us. We looked at each other across the 20 feet of polished wood. It was a 3-second stare, the exact same duration as when he'd stood before the family photo in my office on Wednesday. But this time it was different. This time Marcus didn't turn away. He didn't look at the floor or at Diane. His eyes stayed locked on mine, wide and hauntingly clear. I recognized something in his face I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't hatred. It was a terrifying, naked sort of relief. I didn't have a name for it then, but I felt the silver bracelet in my pocket grew warm. Diane's face didn't just go pale. It froze. It turned into a mask of paralyzed calculation. Her eyes darting toward the lawyer, then back to me, searching for a gap in the armor that wasn't there. Arthur stepped to the bench before Diane's attorney could utter another word. Your Honor, I am Arthur Brennan, counsel for Raymond Cole. As the court can see, Mr. Cole is very much present, fully competent, and acutely aware of every detail of this fraudulent petition. Arthur didn't just speak. He dismantled them. He laid the manila folder on the clerk's desk like he was dropping a hammer. We are submitting into evidence a video log of the petitioner's trespassing in Mr. Cole's private office to surreptitiously inventory his assets. We have an audio recording from yesterday afternoon where Mrs. Cole Hartley explicitly threatens Mr. Cole with this very petition unless he surrenders his company. And most importantly, we have the trust documentation filed yesterday. Mr. Cole's assets are no longer held personally. They are held in a living trust of which he is the sole trustee. This petition is legally moot and factually criminal. Judge Holloway's expression turned into something terrifying. She picked up the medical assessment and turned her gaze to the front row. Dr. Strang, stand up. The doctor stood, his white coat suddenly looking very thin. Dr. Strang, the judge said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet level. Did you conduct an in-person clinical evaluation of Raymond Cole before signing this assessment under penalty of perjury? Strang's throat moved as he swallowed. I reviewed the family's reported history and made a preliminary... I asked you a yes or no question, doctor. The judge interrupted. Did you examine this man in person? The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Strang looked at Diane, then at the floor. No, Your Honor. Judge Holloway looked at the man in the white coat with a chilling finality. Dr. Strang, your signature on this fraudulent assessment is a direct violation of your oath, an emergency injunction, and the immediate suspension of your medical credentials will be issued to the board within the hour. Officers escort this individual for formal questioning regarding perjury. She looked at the two officers from the DA's office who were now standing by the railing. Officers, take these individuals into custody. I am referring this entire matter to District Attorney Cooper for immediate prosecution on charges of elder financial exploitation, misrepresentation of medical testimony, and conspiracy to commit fraud. I stood there, my back straight, as the officers stepped forward. They moved toward the table. I watched as they placed the handcuffs on Diane first. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at me with a cold, hollow hatred that confirmed everything Eleanor had written in her letter. Then they turned to Marcus. He didn't resist. He stood up and held out his wrists, his eyes still fixed on mine. As the metal clicked shut, he looked at me with a strange, broken sort of dignity. He didn't say a word. He didn't plead. He just allowed himself to be led away, his head bowed. I watched them escort my son out of that courtroom. He didn't look back. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut with a dull, final thud, leaving the room echoing with the ghost of his footsteps. I stood there long after the room had cleared. Arthur was talking to the judge's clerk, and Danny was standing by the back row, his hat in his hand, watching me with a look of profound respect. But I kept my eyes on that closed door. I was waiting for something, a feeling of victory perhaps, or a sense of peace. But it didn't come. I just felt the weight of the suit and the silence of the room. I was waiting for a son who no longer existed to walk back through that door and tell me it was all a mistake. But the door stayed shut, and for the first time in 73 years, I realized that some things once broken can never be rebuilt, no matter how good the tools are. The courtroom emptied in less than 10 minutes. The heavy silence that followed was different from the one I'd lived with for the last 3 weeks. This one didn't feel like a countdown. It felt like a funeral. Arthur Brennan stood by the mahogany rail, slowly tucking his fountain pen into his vest pocket. We were the last two people left inside the room where my son had just been led away in steel restraints. Arthur looked at me, his eyes tired behind his spectacles. "It is over, Ray," he said, his voice echoing slightly against the high ceilings. I looked at the petitioner's table, still strewn with the fraudulent documents Diane had prepared with such cold precision. I looked at the empty chair where Marcus had sat, staring at nothing. "No, Arthur," I said, my voice sounding older than I felt. "It is not over. It will never be completely over. You can't unfire a bullet once the trigger has been pulled." Arthur didn't argue with that. He just walked over and squeezed my shoulder, a brief, solid weight of 27 years of friendship. "I'll handle the paperwork with the clerk of the court. Go home, Ray. D.A. Cooper will be in touch by Monday. The formal charges will be processed by then." I walked out of the courthouse, my leather shoes clicking on the marble. Outside, the late October sun was stretching long, golden fingers across the granite steps. For the first time in nearly a month, I actually noticed the weather. The air was sharp-smelling of pine and the coming winter. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in, trying to find something clean in the atmosphere to wash away the scent of that courtroom. I didn't feel like a victor. I mostly just felt tired, a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of coffee could touch. When I pulled into my driveway, the Ford Expedition's engine ticking as it cooled, I saw Rosa and Danny standing on the front porch. Rosa looked smaller than usual, her shoulders hunched, a white handkerchief bunched in her hand. She had been crying. As I stepped onto the porch, she moved toward me, her eyes red-rimmed. She started to go down on her knees, her voice a broken whisper of, "I'm sorry, Mr. Cole. I'm so sorry." I caught her by the elbows and pulled her up immediately. I didn't let go. I held both her hands in mine, feeling the calluses of 14 years of honest work. "Rosa, look at me," I said, my voice firm. "You protected this family the only way you could. You were a victim of a man who should have known better. Eleanor would have forgiven you without a second thought. And so do I." She sobbed, then a ragged sound of relief. I let her lean against my arm for a moment. "There is nothing left to apologize for, Rosa. You're home. We're all home." Danny stood by the door, his hat in his hand. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. He'd stayed, he'd watched my back, and he'd seen the ugly truth. "I'll get the groceries from the truck, sir," he said quietly. "Then I'll start on some dinner." That evening, the house felt strange. The oak trees outside were whispering in the wind, but the internal lying I had felt in Task 1 was gone. The foundation was cracked, yes, but the rot had been cut out. I sat at the kitchen table and called Pete Galloway. It took him 4 rings to answer. When he did, his voice was hollow, the sound of a man waiting for the axe to fall. "Pete," I said, leaning back in the chair Eleanor had bought for this kitchen, "I am not letting you go. Cole Industrial needs an operations manager who knows the value of the truth." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end. I could hear his ragged breathing. "Why, sir, after I gave her those files." "Because you didn't do it for greed, Pete. You did it out of fear, and you stepped forward when it counted. But there's a condition. Tomorrow you go to D.A. Cooper's office voluntarily. You make a full sworn statement about the expense reports and exactly how Diane used them to coerce you. I've already spoken to Arthur. He'll go with you. I will stand with you through the entire legal process." "I don't understand, Mr. Cole. Why stand with me?" "Because it's the right thing to do," I said, looking at the faded height marks Eleanor had made for Marcus on the pantry doorframe. "And because it's exactly what Eleanor would have wanted me to do. She believed in second chances for men who were brave enough to admit they'd stumbled." Danny made dinner, a simple pot of stew and cornbread. The three of us sat at the kitchen table, Rosa, Danny, and me. It was a strange assembly, a family built of loyalty rather than blood. It was the first time in 2 weeks I had sat down and eaten a full meal without my stomach feeling like it was full of hot lead. We didn't talk about the courtroom. We talked about the workshop, the weather, and the old oak trees. After Rosa went home and Danny fell asleep on the sofa for the third night in a row, I walked into my office. I didn't sit in the dark. I turned on the desk lamp, the warm light spilling across the walnut box, and the property deeds Arthur had returned to me. I looked at the family photograph on the shelf. I knew exactly where the camera was tucked into that tiny gap between the mahogany frame and the book on thermodynamics. I reached out to take it down to rid my sanctuary of that unblinking eye. But I stopped. My hand hovered in the air, then dropped. Not tonight. Tonight I needed to remember that the truth required a witness. I shifted my gaze to the armchair by the window, Eleanor's armchair. I sat in it, feeling the familiar contours of the leather. I knew Arthur was wrong. This wasn't the end. The legal machinery of Millhaven was just beginning to turn. There would be a sentencing hearing in January. There would be months of news reports, depositions, and the cold reality of a prison cell for my only son. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I would have to sit in another room and watch them decide if Marcus would spend years of his life behind a wall. I thought of his face when the metal clicked around his wrists. He hadn't asked for mercy. He had just looked at me. I stood up, clicked off the lamp, and walked upstairs. For the first time in 3 weeks, the house didn't feel like it was watching me. For the first time in 3 weeks, I crawled into bed and didn't stare at the ceiling. I closed my eyes, and the darkness was just darkness, not a hiding place for secrets. I slept. I did not leave the property on Saturday. I spent the day walking the perimeter of the 12 acres, checking the fences, and watching the Tennessee wind shake the last of the stubborn gold leaves from the oaks. It was a day of silence, a necessary recalibration before the world started turning again. Sunday morning, I woke before the sun. I dressed in a clean shirt and drove the Ford Expedition down to First Methodist for the 8 o'clock service. It was the first time I had stepped inside that sanctuary since before the filing cabinet drawer had told me my life was under siege. The sanctuary was mostly empty at 8 o'clock, occupied only by a few early risers and the heavy, peaceful scent of floor wax and old hymnals. The morning light was coming through the stained glass on the east wall, exactly as it had for 100 years, broad, slanted beams of orange and gold that stretched across the worn wooden pews like a benediction. Eleanor used to love this specific hour. She'd sit right here and tell me that the way the light hit the dust motes made her feel like the week was starting over, clean and new, no matter what had happened the Monday before. I sat in the third pew, the same spot we'd occupied for 3 decades. A few minutes later, I felt the bench shift as Pastor Roy sat down beside me. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask about the courtroom or the news that was surely beginning to ripple through the quiet streets of Millhaven. He just sat there in his Sunday robes, his presence a steady, familiar weight. We stayed like that for 15, maybe 20 minutes. We didn't pray out loud. We didn't look at each other. We just watched the gold light crawl across the altar. In a town like this, sometimes the greatest kindness a man can offer is the permission to be silent. Finally, Roy stood up, leaning in close so only I could hear him. "Eleanor would be proud of you, Ray," he said softly. I gave a single stiff nod. My throat felt like it was full of dry leaves, and I knew if I tried to speak, the composure I'd spent all morning building would shatter. He patted my shoulder once and walked toward the vestry. He didn't need me to say anything. He knew. As I sat there, I found myself thinking about Sunday mornings when Marcus was small. I could almost feel the weight of him against my arm, his head lolling in sleep against my Sunday jacket, while the sermon droned on. I remembered Eleanor reaching across Marcus's head to squeeze my hand, her eyes bright with a secret, shared smile. Those mornings were real. Whatever Marcus had become, whatever Diane had whispered into his ear, they couldn't reach back through time and unmake those hours. They belonged to me, and they were the only part of him I had left that wasn't broken. I slipped out of the side door before the 9 o'clock congregation began to arrive. I wasn't ready for the handshakes or the pitying looks. I shook Roy's hand at the door. "I am always here, Ray," he said. I looked at his honest, weathered face and knew it was the truth. Back at the house, the silence felt different, less like a vacuum and more like a space waiting to be filled. I went into the office. The desk lamp was off the autumn sun, providing enough light to see the work that needed to be done. I decided then to do something I had been procrastinating on for 5 years. I began to clear the bottom bookshelves. They hadn't been properly sorted since Eleanor passed. I moved slowly, sitting on the floor with a cardboard box beside me. I filtered through old machinery catalogs from the 80s leather-bound ledgers, from Coal Industrial's first struggling decade, and an old King James Bible with Eleanor's delicate, slanted handwriting in the margins. Each item was a layer of a life I was finally allowed to own again. Deep in the corner of the bottom shelf, tucked behind a worn recipe notebook, with a faded green fabric cover the one where Eleanor had meticulously recorded every dish she ever made for company, I felt something stiff and paper-thin. I pulled it out. It was a legal-sized envelope. It had yellowed with age, the edges slightly softened by the Tennessee humidity. The seal was still intact, brittle and dry. On the front, in the small, careful cursive, I would recognize anywhere in the world Eleanor had written for Raymond. "When you need it most." My breath hitched in my chest. I didn't stand up. I stayed there on the floor, the cold oak boards beneath me, and I held that envelope in both hands. It felt impossibly light, yet it carried the weight of 23 years of silence. I walked over to her armchair by the window, the burgundy leather sighing as I sat down. I looked at her handwriting for a long time, tracing the letters with my thumb. The house was quiet. The oaks outside were still. The lying was over, the truth had been told in court, and yet I felt like the most important part of the story was sitting in my lap wrapped in yellowed paper. I didn't think about the sentencing in January. I didn't think about Marcus in his cell. I only thought about the woman who had picked out this chair and who had somehow known nearly a quarter-century ago that there would come a Sunday when I would be sitting in it, needing to hear her voice. I took a deep breath, the silver bracelet cold against my wrist, and then I opened it. 3 pages. Her handwriting was as I remembered it, the small, careful cursive she used for Sunday letters and birthday cards, the kind of script that felt like it was leaning into the wind. The paper was thin, almost translucent, carrying the faint, ghostly scent of the cedar chest, where she'd kept her most private things. The letter was dated November 12, 1998, 3 months before the cancer finally took her breath. She wrote that she had spent weeks trying to find the right moment to say these things to me out loud, but the strength in her lungs was failing faster than the thoughts in her head. She couldn't risk taking the truth to the Millhaven Cemetery. She described the first time Marcus brought Diane home to meet us. It was a Friday in October, much like the one we had just survived. We'd had pot roast and mashed potatoes. After dinner, while Marcus and I had gone out to the workshop to look at a new hydraulic press I'd just installed, Eleanor had stayed in the kitchen. She wrote that she'd stepped out onto the back porch to get some air. The medicine was making her nauseous even then, and she heard Diane's voice coming from the garden. Diane was on her cell phone, her back to the house. Eleanor wrote the words exactly as she had heard them transcribed with a chilling clinical accuracy. "The old man has more than he deserves, and he's obsessed with that shop. Don't worry, it isn't going to last. I'll make sure of it." I felt the air leave my lungs as I read that sentence. 23 years. She had been a predator from the very first dinner, measuring the drapes before she'd even cleared her plate. Eleanor explained in the letter why she had kept it from me. She wrote about the fear that had kept her silent, the fear that I would think she was being an overprotective mother, unfair to a woman she had only just met. She was terrified of the wedge it would drive between me and Marcus if she was wrong. "You would have listened to me, Ray," she wrote, and I could almost hear her voice in the quiet of the office. And then you would have given Diane every chance in the world to prove me wrong, because that is the kind of man you are. You believe in the best of people until they give you no other choice. But I have a feeling in my soul that she wouldn't have needed very many chances. Then she wrote about Marcus, and I felt my hand begin to tremble against the burgundy leather of the armchair. Marcus is not a bad man, Ray. He is just an unsteady one. There are people in this world who are anchors like you, and then there are people who are sails. Marcus is a sail. Unsteady people become whoever the most certain person around them needs them to be. They don't lead. They adapt to the strongest wind. You must watch out for him, Ray. Not because he will ever set out to hurt you on purpose, but because he will let someone else use him to do it. He won't know how to say no to a voice that sounds like conviction. The last page of the letter was smudged in one corner, as if a drop of water had fallen on the ink before it dried. You have always believed the best in the people you love. It's what I loved most about you from the moment we met in Nashville. But sometimes, Ray, the people we love don't need us to be kind. They need us to see them clearly. They need us to be the mirror they're afraid to look into. Trust your instincts. You built everything around us from nothing but a toolbox and a dream. I have never doubted for a single second that you can protect it. I love you, Ray. Always. Eleanor. I read it twice, my eyes tracing the loops of her L's and the sharp peaks of her M's. I set the pages down on the arm of the chair and looked out the window. The Tennessee fields were dissolving into the deep, bruised purple of twilight. The oaks were silent silhouettes against the horizon. I hadn't noticed the afternoon slipping away. I hadn't noticed the chill creeping into the room. I didn't cry immediately. The feeling didn't come as a sharp burst of grief. It moved through me slowly, like a deep-sea current rising to the surface. It was a strange, heavy realization. For 23 years I had thought I was alone in my doubts. I thought the lying in the house was a new phenomenon. But Eleanor had known. She had seen the fracture in Marcus's character before it ever became a break. She had seen the wolf at the garden gate while I was still busy showing my son how to run a lathe. When the tears finally came, they weren't for the betrayal. They weren't for the sentencing hearing waiting in January or the money Diane had tried to steal. I cried for the woman who had carried that secret into her grave, just to give me a few more years of believing my son was the man I wanted him to be. I cried because she had found a way through a yellowed envelope and a green recipe book to be in the room with me when the floor finally fell through. I sat in that armchair until the room was completely dark, the only light coming from the moon reflecting off the silver bracelet on the side table. I felt a profound sense of clarity. The accuracy I had asked for in court wasn't just about the law. It was about Eleanor's legacy. I stood up, my joints popping in the quiet. I walked over to the mahogany desk and clicked on the small lamp. I picked up the 3 pages of Eleanor's letter, folded them along their original creases, and walked to the filing cabinet. I opened the top drawer, the one that had started this whole journey on a Tuesday morning. I placed the letter in the very front, right next to the property deeds I'd fought to protect. I shut the drawer tight, hearing the solid, heavy click of the latch. The house wasn't lying to me anymore. Eleanor had made sure of that. 3 months is a long time when you are waiting for a gavel to fall. January 2023 arrived in Millhaven draped in a heavy slate-gray sky and a biting wind that rattled the windows of the county courthouse. It was the day of the formal sentencing hearing, the final period at the end of a long, dark sentence. I wore the charcoal suit again. It felt looser on me now, a testament to the weight I'd lost since that Tuesday morning in October. I sat on the same side of the courtroom in the same wooden pew, but nothing else felt the same. The preliminary motions were over. The charges had been sustained: elder financial exploitation, conspiracy, and fraud. Both Marcus and Diane now had separate legal counsel, the first crack in the united front that had nearly dismantled my life. Marcus was brought in first. He wasn't wearing a suit this time. He wore a simple gray collared shirt, no tie, no jacket. He looked haggard, his face lined with a weariness that went deeper than skin. As he walked past the gallery, his eyes searched for mine. It was a brief, flickering contact, the look of a man checking to see if a landmark was still standing after a storm. Then he turned his head and stared straight at the judge's bench. The hearing proceeded with a grim, clinical efficiency. Diane's lawyer stood first, spinning a sophisticated web of arguments about limited culpability and emotional distress. He painted her as a woman who had simply been overzealous in protecting a family legacy. Diane sat perfectly still, her face a mask of practiced indifference. Then Marcus's lawyer stood up. He was an older man, a public defender with a voice like gravel. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the lawyerly jargon. "My client wishes to amend his previous statement and submit new evidence to the court regarding the origins of this conspiracy." The room erupted in a low, buzzing murmur. Diane's lawyer was on his feet in an instant, shouting an objection. Judge Holloway didn't raise her voice. She simply held up one hand, a silent command that froze the room. Both lawyers sat down. Marcus stood up. He didn't look at the gallery. He didn't look at Diane. He looked directly at Judge Holloway. His voice was flat and careful. The voice of a man who had rehearsed his words until they were as smooth as river stones. Yet they still carried the jagged edges of truth. He told the court that the plan to seize guardianship had never been his idea. He described the timeline with a devastating chronological clarity. Diane had first proposed the idea 2 years before the petition was ever filed. She was the one who had identified the specific legal loopholes in Tennessee's probate code. She was the one who had scouted Dr. Strang. She was the one who had coordinated the pressure on Pete Galloway to leak the financial logs. "I agreed to it," Marcus said, his voice cracking for the first time. "I knew it was wrong. I watched her map out my father's life like it was a territory to be conquered, and I said nothing. I let her lead me because I didn't know how to stand on my own." He submitted a digital file containing 3 months of text messages between himself and Diane. The instructions, the cold tactical directives, his own hesitant questions, and her sharp, manipulative responses. It was a roadmap of a master and an apprentice. It showed a clear pattern of direction from one side and hollow compliance from the other. Diane's lawyer protested, calling it a desperate attempt to shift blame. For the first time that day, Diane turned her head. She didn't look at Marcus. She looked at me. Her expression wasn't one of plea or regret. It was pure assessment, the look of a gambler realizing she'd miscalculated the odds, but was already looking for the next game. Judge Holloway called for order. She spent nearly 20 minutes in her chambers reviewing the transcripts of the messages. When she returned, the atmosphere in the room had shifted from clinical to heavy. She looked at the documents, then turned her gaze toward me. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "This new testimony and evidence significantly alter the court's understanding of the degrees of culpability in this case. The court would welcome a statement from you regarding your son's role in these events, should you choose to offer one." I looked at Marcus. He was staring down at the table, his hands laid flat against the wood, the exact same pose he'd held on the day of the first hearing. But this time his shoulders weren't squared in defiance. They were slumped in a total, crushing admission of defeat. I thought of Eleanor's letter. Unsteady, not a bad man. He will become whoever the most certain person around him needs him to be. I realized then that for the last 20 years, the certain person had been Diane. But today, standing in this room where the truth was the only currency left, the certain person was me. I stood up. The charcoal suit felt heavy. Every person in that courtroom was watching me. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys. The officers by the door shifted their weight. And Marcus looked up. For a heartbeat, a single drawn-out breath, the 40 years between us vanished. He didn't look like a defendant or a traitor. He looked exactly like he did when he was 6 years old and had broken something precious in the workshop. He was waiting. He was standing in the wreckage of his own choices, waiting to see what kind of father I was going to be. I looked at the judge, then at my son. I felt the silver bracelet in my pocket, the one Eleanor had worn until the day she died. I knew what I had to say, not because it was kind, but because it was the only way to finally stop the lying. I had not planned what I was going to say. I didn't have a yellow legal pad filled with notes, and I didn't look at Arthur for guidance. But I had been thinking about this moment for 3 months, every time I sat in Eleanor's armchair, every time I looked at that filing cabinet, every time I stood in the workshop and watched the lathes turn. I stood in the center of the courtroom, the charcoal suit feeling like a second skin. I spoke for about 4 minutes. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the same clinical, unwavering tone I used when explaining a mechanical failure to a client. I told Judge Holloway that the patterns of behavior shown in the text messages Marcus had submitted were entirely consistent with what I had observed through my own eyes. I confirmed the footage from the hidden camera and the audio I had recorded in the shirt pocket of this very suit at the Millhaven Grill. I stated for the record that in my professional and personal assessment, Diane Hartley Cole had been the architect, the surveyor, and the foreman of this entire operation. My son participated in a plan he did not originate, I said, looking directly at the judge. And based on what I saw through that camera, the way he looked at our family's history, the way he hesitated when the papers were spread across my desk, he was never fully certain of the path he was on. He was a man being driven by a stronger will. I stopped there. I didn't ask for leniency. I didn't ask the court to forget that my son had been willing to put me in a cage. I am not asking for kindness, Your Honor, I added. I am asking for accuracy. There is a difference. The law should reflect the hand that held the pen, not just the hand that was forced to hold the paper. Judge Holloway nodded slowly. She called for a 20-minute recess to review the sentencing guidelines in light of the new evidence. Arthur sat beside me, but we didn't talk. The only sound in the room was the quiet ticking of the wall clock each second, marking the end of a family's history. When the judge returned, the air in the room felt heavy, as if the gravity had been turned up. She didn't waste time. Diane Hartley Cole, the judge began, her voice ringing out like a strike on an anvil. For your role as the primary architect of this conspiracy, for the exploitation of an elder, and for the premeditated attempt to defraud this court, you are sentenced to 7 years in a state correctional facility. Diane didn't flinch. She stood there like a statue, her face a mask of cold, unyielding marble. Marcus Cole, the judge continued, in light of your amended testimony, your cooperation with the district attorney, and the mitigating evidence provided by the victim, you are sentenced to 3 years. This court recognizes your participation, but also acknowledges the influence under which you acted. Let this be the last time you allow another's will to supersede your own. The penalties didn't stop there. Dr. Philip Strang's medical license was permanently revoked, and he was sentenced to 18 months. Diane's attorney, the man in the silver tie who had invaded my office, was disbarred and sentenced to 14 months for his role in the fabrication of legal documents. As the officers moved in to lead them away, the room felt strangely small. Marcus didn't wait to be prompted. He stood up on his own, his movements slow and deliberate. Before they led him through the side door, he stopped. He looked at me across the gallery, his eyes searching mine. "Dad," he whispered. It was barely audible, but in the silence of that courtroom, it sounded like a shout. Why did you speak for me?" I looked at my son, 44 years old, and heading into a darkness of his own making. "Because your mother would have wanted me to," I said. "She knew you were unsteady, Marcus. She didn't want you to be lost forever." He looked like he wanted to say something more, but the officer tapped his shoulder. He turned and walked through the door without looking back. Diane was escorted out next. She didn't look at Marcus. As she reached the exit, she stopped for one final second. She turned her head and gave me that same look she'd given me at the grill, the cold, assessing gaze of a predator who had lost a hunt but was already calculating the cost of the next one. Then the door clicked shut behind her, and the shadow she'd cast over my house for years finally began to lift. Outside, the steps of the courthouse were cold. Arthur stood beside me, his hands in his overcoat pockets. The January sun was hiding behind a thick layer of clouds, leaving the Millhaven streets in a flat, gray light. "You didn't have to do that, Leigh," Arthur said, looking at the quiet traffic on Main Street. "You didn't owe him that statement." I know," I said, adjusting my tie. "But I owed it to Eleanor, and I owed it to the man I used to be. You can't protect a legacy by becoming as hollow as the people trying to steal it." Arthur nodded. "D.A. Cooper will handle the transport logistics. It's over, Ray." Truly. I stood on those granite steps and watched a woman I didn't know walk a small dog past the courthouse. She didn't look up. She didn't know that inside those brick walls a family had been dismantled and a man had found his footing again. I thought about Marcus stepping onto that transport bus. He was 44 today. He would be 47 when he walked back into the Tennessee sun. I would be 76. I didn't know what either of us would look like by then, or if the 3 years of silence between us would be a bridge or a wall. But as I walked back toward my Ford Expedition, I realized I had done the only thing a man could do. I had told the truth. I had protected the house Eleanor loved. I had done what I could today, and in a world where everything can be stolen in a Tuesday morning, today was all I had. I drove home. The workshop was quiet, but I knew Danny would have the lights on. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was just a man going back to work. 6 weeks later, on a damp Thursday afternoon in late February, Arthur called me. The winter in Millhaven was stubbornly clinging to the ground, a gray slush covering the workshop parking lot. I was in the office checking the inventory for a new line of hydraulic seals when the phone rang. Arthur's voice carried a tone I hadn't heard before, a measured tactical caution that meant he was holding a live wire. "Right, Tita," he said, skipping the usual talk about the weather. "We've got a tail on the dog. A civil suit was filed this morning against Cole Industrial in the Chancery Court. The plaintiff was a man named Gerald Foss." The name hit me like a faint echo from a crowded room. 12 years ago, Foss had been a primary steel supplier for us. We'd had a messy contract dispute over a shipment of substandard alloy that had stalled our production for 2 months. I remembered the long meetings, the tense negotiations, and finally the settlement we'd signed in this very office. I had walked away, believing the book was closed, the debt settled, and the bridges burned but cleared of debris. Arthur explained the angle. The settlement paperwork from 2011 contained a faint technical ambiguity in the liability release clause, a single poorly drafted paragraph regarding unrealized secondary costs. It was the kind of legal ghost that a hungry attorney could summon if they knew exactly where to look. The suit claimed Cole Industrial still owed Foss a sum that, with 12 years of compounded interest, was large enough to force a liquidation of the company's primary assets. "I've spent the morning tracing the timeline of this filing, Ray." Arthur continued, his voice dropping an octave. "Foss's attorney was retained 8 months ago, long before we walked into that courtroom in January. The legal language in the petition isn't just similar to our internal records. It mirrors the exact phrasing of the financial audits Pete Galloway accessed last fall under Diane's direction. The air in my office felt suddenly thin. "She prepared this before we ever went to court," I said. "She knew if the guardianship failed, she needed a way to dismantle the company from the outside." "Exactly," Arthur said. "Gerald Foss isn't the architect here. He's just a man with an old grudge and a lawyer who was handed a map to your gold. The question is whether he realizes whose hand is actually on the shovel." I asked the obvious question, why hadn't she used Pete again? Why involve an outsider like Foss? Because Pete went to the DA voluntarily, Arthur explained. The second he made that statement, the financial records were audited and sealed as part of the criminal evidence chain. Pete's credentials were wiped that same day. Diane's leverage over Pete became worthless the moment he chose the light. But Foss was her contingency. She had him tucked away like a spare blade. We met with Foss in Arthur's conference room the following Tuesday. Foss was a man whose face looked like a topographic map of hard years and bad luck. He sat across from us, staring at his coffee cup, looking less like a victorious plaintiff and more like a man who had caught a fish far too big for his boat. Arthur didn't attack him. He simply laid out the timeline on the polished mahogany table when Foss was first contacted, the identity of the firm that had approached him, and the documented link between that firm and Diane's primary counsel. He showed him the records of Diane's own criminal sentencing. Arthur said, leaning in. You aren't being represented. You're being used as a demolition charge. Once this suit forces a sale of Cole Industrial, the majority of the settlement is structured to flow into a shell account that Diane Hartley Cole established through a third party before her arrest. You'd get the scraps, and Ray here would lose everything he built in 50 years. Is that the legacy you want? Foss was quiet for a long, heavy minute. He wasn't a dishonest man by nature. He was just a tired man who had been told he had a legitimate claim and had been too exhausted to ask the right questions. When he finally looked at me, I saw the shame of an old-school businessman who realized he'd been tricked into a back-alley fight. So I just wanted what was fair, Ray, he said, his voice a dry rasp. They told me the 2011 deal was a sham. The deal was honest, Gerald, I said. You know it, and I know it. Foss stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at Main Street for a moment. Then he turned back to Arthur. Withdraw it. Give me the papers. I'll sign whatever statement you need to put this to bed. The suit was withdrawn 48 hours later. The contingency had failed. Arthur ensured that the record of Diane's involvement in the Foss filing was added to her correctional file, a permanent mark that would surely affect any future talk of early release. I drove back to Millhaven alone that evening. The February sun was a pale sliver on the horizon, casting long blue shadows across the oak trees. The lawsuit was gone. Cole Industrial was intact. Out in the plant, I could hear the night shift, coming on the low rumble of the machines, starting up like a heart that refused to stop beating. I thought about going to see her. I thought about sitting behind a glass partition at the correctional facility and asking her one single question. Was it worth it? But as I pulled into my driveway and saw the lights of my house, Eleanor's house, shining through the dark, I realized I didn't need to ask. I already knew what she would say. A woman like Diane doesn't measure worth in outcomes or happiness or the quiet peace of a home. She measures it in moves. She measures it in the cold satisfaction of seeing a structure collapse, even if she has to burn herself to do it. That was the fundamental difference between us. I build things. I spend my life making sure the tolerances are tight and the foundations are deep so that things will last long after I'm gone. She dismantles them. She looks for the rust, the crack, the weakness, and she pulls until everything falls apart. And yet, as I walked through my front door and heard the familiar silence of a house that was no longer lying to me, I knew who had won. I had the workshop. I had the land. I had Eleanor's armchair. I was still standing, and in the end, that was the only move that mattered. August arrived in the way summer always does in Tennessee, sullen, heavy, and slow. The humidity sat over Millhaven like a wet wool blanket, and inside the Cole Industrial plant, the air felt like the interior of a foundry. 8 months had passed since the gavels fell in that cold January courtroom. The legal machinery had finally ground to a silent halt, leaving behind only the steady rhythmic ticking of a house that had learned how to tell the truth again. Then, on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week this entire nightmare had begun, I found something in the mailbox that wasn't from Marcus. I sat at the kitchen table, the overhead fan whirring uselessly against the August heat. The envelope had a correctional facility postmark, but the handwriting was a sharp, disciplined cursive that I recognized instantly. It was Diane's. Even behind bars, her script was controlled, elegant, and devoid of the tremors of regret. I opened it with a kitchen knife, my hand steady, despite the sudden chill in my bones. Diane didn't offer a greeting. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask for money or a shorter sentence. She wrote because she wanted me to know something, a piece of the story she had kept tucked away like a hidden blade. She described a night 8 months before the guardianship petition was ever filed. It was a rainy Tuesday in Ridgeline Estates. Marcus had come home late from the workshop, sat across from her at their marble kitchen island, and told her he wanted to stop. He told her he couldn't go through with the plan to lock me away. He said the weight of the lie was starting to crush him. Diane wrote that she didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply reached into her briefcase and laid 2 items on the table between them. The first was a pre-drafted divorce petition, accompanied by a financial settlement that would leave Marcus with exactly the amount of debt he had brought into the marriage. Nothing more, nothing less. He would walk away from the house, the Cadillac, and the life she had built for him. The second item was a folder containing copies of the initial documents Marcus had already signed during the preparation of the guardianship plan, enough evidence of conspiracy to implicate him, regardless of whether he continued or not. I gave him a choice, Mr. Cole. She wrote her words, echoing with a terrifying clinical pride. He looked at the divorce papers. Then he looked at the evidence that would destroy him. He didn't say a word. He didn't look at me. He just folded the papers, pushed them back across the table, and went to bed. We continued the next morning as if the conversation had never happened. Her closing line was a final jagged strike. I want you to know that your son had a choice, Mr. Cole. He chose the lie because he was too afraid of the truth. I thought you deserved to know exactly what kind of man you've been fighting for. I set the letter down on the table. I sat there for a long time, the kitchen clock ticking against the heavy silence. Rosa had already gone home for the day. The house was empty, yet it felt crowded with the ghost of that Tuesday night in Ridgeline Estates. I understood what she was doing. This wasn't a confession. She wasn't seeking absolution. Diane was making one last move from inside her cell, planting a seed of doubt between a father and a son, a weed she hoped would grow until it choked out any chance of reconciliation. She wanted me to know that Marcus hadn't just been a victim. He had been a coward who prioritized his comfort over my freedom. I stood up and grabbed my keys from the counter. I didn't call Arthur. I didn't wait for a scheduled visiting day. I climbed into my Ford Expedition and drove 2 hours north to the Hartwell Correctional Facility. The heat shimmered, dancing off the asphalt like a fever dream. I requested an emergency visit at the front desk, citing urgent family business. I sat in the waiting room for 30 minutes, my eyes fixed on the gray linoleum floor. When the guard finally nodded, I walked through the heavy steel doors into the visiting area. Marcus was led in. He looked thinner than he had in January, his face sallow under the harsh fluorescent lights. He saw me sitting at the plastic table, and then his eyes dropped to the letter in my hand. He didn't need to read it. He knew the weight of it. He knew the shape of the ghost Diane had sent to find me. I placed Diane's letter on the table between us. Marcus looked at it the way a man looks at an execution warrant he's been expecting for a lifetime. No surprise, no sudden fear. Just a profound, crushing weariness. Neither of us spoke. Outside the reinforced windows, the August heat pressed hard against the glass, making the world look warped and distant. I waited for my son to say something, to explain, to lie, to beg. I waited to see if there was anything left of the boy from the workshop. or if the unsteady man Eleanor had warned me about was all that remained. For the first time in my life, Marcus didn't look away. He looked at the letter, then at me, and we sat in a silence that was heavier than any prison wall. I waited. I said, my voice barely a whisper in the crowded room. I waited to hear it from you. Marcus closed his eyes. His jaw worked, but no words came out. He was a man standing in the ruins of his own silence, and for the first time in years, he was actually waiting for the consequences to take hold. Marcus looked at that letter for a long, grueling minute. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a clinical indifference, making the shadows under his eyes look like bruises. Then he looked at me, and he started to talk, not the way he'd spoken in court, not the polished, defensive version rehearsed by a lawyer. This was something raw, stripped of the expensive sweater and the Ridgeline Estates veneer. He confirmed everything in Diane's letter. It was true he'd had his chance to walk away. He had stood at the crossroads that Tuesday night, and he had chosen the wrong path. But he didn't sit there across from me trying to claim that the divorce papers or the incriminating files were what decided it. They were the leverage Diane used, yes, but they weren't the reason he'd folded. She didn't tell you the whole story, Dad. Marcus said, his voice a dry rasp that barely carried across the plastic table. The night I pushed those papers back to her, the night I gave up, I didn't stay in the house. I got in the Cadillac and I drove to Millhaven. I didn't call. I didn't have a plan. I just drove. He told me he'd parked at the end of our old county road, tucked under the shadow of the sycamores, where the streetlights didn't reach. He had sat there for nearly an hour watching the front of our house. My office light had been on the small desk lamp, the one I always kept burning late into the night when I was going over the shop's schematics. "Why didn't you come inside, Marcus?" I asked. My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a pair of heavy-duty pliers. The door wasn't locked. It never is when I'm in the office. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his jaw working. "I didn't know what to say to you, Dad. The truth is, I've never really known what to say to you. Mom always knew. She could walk into a room, and just by the way she sat down, she knew exactly what everyone needed to hear. I never had that. I always said the wrong thing, or I said nothing at all. And that night, sitting in the dark outside your window, I couldn't think of a single sentence that didn't sound like a pathetic excuse. I sat in a profound, heavy silence. I didn't try to fill the gap. In the machinery business, you learn that sometimes you have to let the pressure stabilize before you open the valve. And Diane knew that about me from the very start. Marcus continued, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. She knew I wouldn't come to you. She built the entire plan on that one fact. The fact that you and I don't know how to talk to each other unless it's about torque specs or revenue targets. She knew that if I was scared, I'd turn inward instead of toward my own father. If I had just stepped out of that car, he stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The if was a ghost that was going to haunt him for the next 3 years. I thought about Eleanor's letter again. He is not bad, Ray. He is just unsteady. I looked at the man across the table and realized I was looking at a machine I had failed to maintain. For 44 years, I taught him how to measure steel to the thousandth of an inch. But I never taught him how to measure his own worth. I had lost him long ago to my own silence, never realizing that what I took for respect was actually a wall of fear. That wasn't just Marcus's failure. It was mine too. A machine only runs as well as the person who maintains it, and I had been a negligent mechanic when it came to my own son's heart. I didn't say any of this out loud, but I let it settle in the space between us. "I'm going to make this right, Dad," Marcus said, looking at me with a sudden, desperate clarity. "Not for you. I know I don't have the right to ask you for a single thing. But for me, because I don't want to be the man who sat in that car and then drove away. I'm tired of being a sail dad. I want to be an anchor, I looked at my son across the bolted-down plastic table. He looked older, broken, but for the first time in his life, he looked like a man who was looking at the truth without blinking. I reached out and put my hand on the table palm, up the same gesture of peace I'd offered before. Marcus hesitated for a second, then placed his hand over mine. His grip was firm, but his skin was cold. We sat like that, two men in a room full of glass and steel, finally acknowledging the cost of our silence. We knew that 3 years in Hartwell wasn't just a punishment for a crime. It was the time it was going to take for us to learn how to be father and son again. The guard called time, the heavy buzzer sounding like a strike on an iron plate. I stood up, feeling every one of my 73 years in my joints. I picked up Diane's letter from the table. It felt like a piece of dirty laundry. "I'll be back next month, Marcus," I said. He nodded, a small, genuine movement. "I'll be here, Dad." I drove south on the interstate with the windows down, letting the hot August wind roar through the cab of the Ford Expedition. The heat was stifling, smelling of sun-baked asphalt and dry grass. About 40 miles outside of Millhaven, I pulled into a dusty gas station to get a coffee I didn't really want. I stepped out of the truck, the sun beating down on the crown of my head. I walked over to the rusted trash can beside the pump, and without looking at it again, I tossed Diane's letter inside. I didn't need it. I didn't need her version of the truth anymore. Whatever poison she had tried to plant between my son and me had failed to take root. The wind caught a corner of the envelope, but the weight of the trash held it down. I got back into my truck, turned the ignition, and listened to the engine roar. I wasn't a victim of her moves anymore. I was just a man heading home, and for the first time in 3 years, the road ahead looked like it was finally mine to drive. January 2026. 3 years and 3 months since a Tuesday morning when a stuck filing cabinet drawer told me my world was starting to slide off its axis. The Tennessee winter had settled into the bones of Millhaven, turning the sky into a sheet of cold lead. I drove north alone on a Thursday morning, the headlights of my Ford Expedition cutting through a low, clinging fog that draped over the frozen fields like a shroud. I hadn't told Danny or Rosa or even Pastor Roy. This was a private contract, one last job I had to finish by myself. I pulled into the visitor's lot of the Hartwell Correctional Facility at 8:40 a.m. I turned off the engine and sat there, the cabin slowly cooling as the heater faded. I didn't go inside. I didn't want the fluorescent lights or the buzzing of steel doors today. I just waited. In the silence, 3 years of images flickered through my mind, like old 8mm film. I saw the charcoal suit hanging in the back of my closet, a suit for weddings and funerals that had become a uniform for justice. I saw the green recipe book on the shelf, and the yellow envelope tucked in the top drawer, the one I kept shut tight. I thought of Pete Galloway, steadier now, his eyes no longer darting to the shadows, and Danny standing at the whiteboard during the Monday morning meetings, leading Coal Industrial with a hand that was starting to look a lot like mine. I'd held the line. The 12 acres were still mine. The workshop was still humming. The house I'd built with my own hands was still standing. I hadn't lost what they had aimed for. I had protected the foundation, but the cost had been written in the silence of my hallways every night for over 1,000 days. At 9:17 a.m., the release gate at the side of the facility groaned open. Marcus stepped out. He was wearing a pair of dark jeans and a heavy flannel shirt, the ones I'd sent him last month through the approved clothing channel, no note included, just the fabric he'd need for a Tennessee January. He carried a small mesh bag of belongings. He stopped just outside the gate, shoulders hunched against the damp chill, his eyes scanning the road for the bus stop out of habit. Then he saw the black Ford Expedition sitting in the middle row. He stood perfectly still for a long 10 seconds, making sure the fog wasn't playing tricks on him. Then he began to walk. I watched him cross the asphalt through the windshield. I didn't get out. I didn't wave. I just waited, my hands resting steady on the steering wheel. Marcus reached the passenger side and tapped twice on the glass, a hesitant, rhythmic sound. I reached over and hit the power window. The cold January air rushed in, smelling of wet earth and exhaust. We looked at each other. Marcus's face had aged 3 years of hard miles, carved deeper by the weight of what those years had contained. I imagined my own face looked the same to him, a map of the same storm we'd both survived. "You didn't have to come, Dad," Marcus said, his breath hitching in the cold. "I know," I said, the same words we'd traded in the visiting room 15 months ago. But the distance between us had shifted. Back then, I'd driven 2 hours to deliver a letter of betrayal. Today, I'd driven 2 hours to bring my son back to the world. I hit the door locks. Marcus opened the door, set his bag on the floorboards, and climbed in. He sat there staring straight ahead through the windshield at the mist-covered fields. I turned the ignition, and the engine roared to life, a deep mechanical growl that felt like the first honest sound of the year. We drove in silence for the first 20 miles. It was the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled, a solid, heavy quiet that belonged to two men who had run out of excuses. "Where are we going, Dad?" Marcus asked finally, as we hit the interstate heading south. I kept my eyes on the road, watching the white lines disappear under the hood. "Home," a single word. Marcus gave a small, sharp nod. He didn't ask what that meant or what would happen when we crossed the threshold. He didn't ask if Diane's shadow was still in the guest room or if the town of Millhaven was still whispering. I didn't have those answers anyway. There was no plan further than the 2-hour drive and the gravel driveway waiting at the end of it. As we crossed the county line into Millhaven, I saw the oaks lining the old road. Back in October, they had been a riot of gold and copper, a beautiful lie hiding their brittle branches. Now, in January, they were stripped bare. You could see the architecture of them, the hard, twisted shapes they'd grown into over 100 years. I'd always liked them better this way. You could see what they were made of when the world got cold. I turned into the driveway at 11:43. The workshop was dark. Thursday was Danny's day off. The house was quiet. Rosa wouldn't be by until tomorrow. The 12 acres lay still and gray under the January sky. I turned off the engine. Marcus and I sat in the truck for a minute, neither of us moving. Then I opened my door. I heard the solid thud of his door closing behind me. We walked toward the front porch, not exactly side by side, but moving in the same direction, our shadows overlapping on the frost-covered grass. I reached the door. I pulled the heavy brass key from my pocket, the one I'd never changed, the one I'd kept waiting. I slid it into the lock. I turned it. The door opened. I stepped inside, and I felt the warmth of the house meet me. It was the same house, but the lying was gone. It was just a house again. Marcus stepped in behind me, and I heard the door click shut, sealing us in. That was the whole story. I had built it. I had protected it. And now I was going to live in it. That was enough. Looking back at the structural fatigue of my own life, I've realized that silence is a poor adhesive for a home. I spent 50 years mastering machines, thinking that if the foundation was solid and the parts were oiled, the engine of my family would run forever. I was wrong. My silence created the shadows where Diane's whispers could take root. Don't be like me. Don't assume that providing for those you love is the same as knowing them. Every family story has its fractures, but we often ignore the hairline cracks until the whole beam snaps. I thought I was being strong by staying quiet, but I was just leaving the door unlocked for a predator. These grandpa stories I share aren't just about betrayal. They are about the cost of disconnected hearts. My perspective now is that of a man who saved his shop but nearly lost his soul. I believe that life, much like a complex machine, requires constant calibration and honest conversation. I am grateful to God that I found Eleanor's letter before it was too late. Without her voice from the past, this family story would have ended in a facility, and my son would have been a ghost I never tried to reach. It's a heavy family story to carry, but it taught me that looking clearly at someone is the truest form of love. These grandpa stories should serve as a warning. Build your legacy with words of truth, not just bricks and steel. In the end, these grandpa stories are all we leave behind. Thank you for walking with me to the final mile of this journey. I'd value your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in Raymond's shoes, facing a betrayal from your own blood? I'm truly interested in your perspective. If this narrative resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming journeys. A quick note: while inspired by complex social dynamics and real-world struggles, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this content doesn't align with your personal taste, feel free to explore other videos that better suit your interests.